Hey everybody, back with a little more content from the content mines here on YouTube. First, wanted to say thanks to everybody who commented on the last video about Tim Walz. Really awesome discussion. That's a huge part of why I started this channel, was to interact and try to get smarter on stuff, think of stuff that I hadn't thought of before. Really that coming from y'all, so really appreciate it. That's much more than views or subscribers or any other metrics. I don't care that much about that stuff. I really care about the comment section, and short of people who are just coming in to stand for I don't know, MAGA or something and just saying totally unhinged things. I try to interact with everybody there, and that's really what gets me going with this channel. So appreciate it as always, and definitely comment on this video if you have questions or things that interest you about it. And to jump right in there, what I wanted to talk about briefly today was what is going on with Venezuela, with Trump in Venezuela, with Maduro, and potentially leaving Venezuela. What's driving from a sort of scholarly, game theoretic or academic perspective? What are the underlying factors that are driving this offer to Nicolas Maduro to receive basically safe haven, to receive pardons here in the United States from the Justice Department? Why would that be offered? And then conversely, why might someone like Trump be interested in fleeing to a place like Venezuela? And I'll kind of tackle it in that order. I think these are somewhat related. The first thing to kind of really think about here is, why would the Biden administration offer Maduro amnesty or safe haven or a refuge? Why would he even need that? This can be, I think, very confusing to look at from the outside, right? This is obviously a bad guy, a bad person, not an ally of the United States, not somebody that we would be interested in having supporting in this country, or even involving ourselves with in any way, probably on an ideological level. The issue, I think, that the State Department and the Justice Department and the Biden administration writ large are seeing in this conflict, in this sort of simmering conflict in Venezuela, is it's a sophisticated perspective, I think, in looking at how dictators, autocrats, strongmen, this pattern continues to repeat itself. Folks like Gregory have done a lot of research on this, how initially, and this is certainly how I was taught about this sort of coming up in grade school, was, these people tend, your dictators of the world tend to be just insane egomaniacs, and that's why they behave so irrationally. And what folks like Gregory and other folks like Hayek and Mesquita and folks like that have started to sort of interrogate is that really that convincing of a model of authoritarian leadership? But their assertion is that if you wanted to study this in sort of a systematic and scientific way, you would need evidence. You would need some evidence to suggest that these folks are crazy, and that's going to be hard to come by, right? To sort of posthumously diagnose people with mental illness. So they suggest maybe a more effective research strategy for looking at why dictators are so violent and why they crack down so much on their opposition, is that they're actually behaving quite rationally in a system where obviously the jeopardy for them personally is extremely high, and where their information about their society is extremely low. And this is sort of saying, obviously, if the dictator had perfect information, they could very targetedly kind of go into their civil society and eliminate people who would stand up against them, and do that accurately. That would be their preference. But unfortunately, people in opposition to unfortunately for dictators, people in opposition to them in their societies, in their respective societies, are obviously going to hide, right? They're going to try to surreptitiously take down the dictator, because obviously if they're discovered, they will die. So from sort of a data science perspective, you could think about it as, for the dictator, if you're taking their sort of position and assuming it to be rational for the sake of argument, and because I think assuming them to be rational is a more conservative sort of starting position to analyze their behavior, the risk of a false negative, that is, the risk of assuming someone is not plotting against you when in fact they are, is essentially infinite, right? That the impact of that to you personally the downside risk is potentially infinite there, because they're aiming to kill you. Conversely, the risk of a false positive, that is punishing someone who wasn't actually plotting against you, and falsely identifying them as that kind of individual, is actually quite low, right? Because by definition, you are a dictator. You are above the law in your respective polity. You are the law. So the only people trying to stop you are already contained within that group of people who are trying to stop you, right? And those are the exact people you're targeting. So it's really a false positive, false negative kind of question. And when you start to look at it this way, given imperfect information, given the high downside risk, the personal jeopardy that applies to dictators if they get this wrong, it actually makes a lot of sense that they would tend to crack down really heavily on political opposition, which is exactly what we've seen with Nicolas Maduro. Relatedly, folks like Brooker have found that the rate of coup attempts is probably about twice as high in authoritarian dictatorships as other forms of government. So this kind of backs up this idea that there is some kind of inherent rationality in a sick way, in a self-centered way, if you're the dictator, in cracking down on people at a higher rate. And what this does, of course, because you can't predict as a dictator who's going to move against you, a couple of things come out of this. One is really a marketplace for subordinates that really prioritizes loyalty over competence, right? You're much more likely as a dictator to hire and promote people within the system who are loyal to you, but who may be not particularly skilled at their job, as opposed to really high intelligence operators who can move against you. Conversely, obviously, as you exist as a dictator, as that system kind of trundles forward, you will alienate and punish more and more people, and potentially a larger and larger group of people who you're sort of radicalizing against your regime, right? They would not have been folks who would have originally moved against you, but now would, because you have wrapped them up in that they're one of those false positives, essentially, and you've now radicalized them by hurting them in some way. And what this produces is really a system that is contributive to sort of a trap, right? A trap for dictators, which is the further you sort of move into this position that's above the law, the harder it is to sort of extricate yourself. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Maduro now, and why the Justice Department and the State Department and the Biden administration writ large would be interested in offering this kind of amnesty or this kind of pardon, is they essentially want to give this guy an escape hatch, right? Because he's not going to be able to make that escape in Venezuela, right? There's just no way. He's made too many enemies. He's alienated too many people. He's given too many people motivation to personally remove him from power, and probably more, frankly, for him to ever feel like he could step away without intense, really existential jeopardy to his own safety, his own life, the life of his family, that kind of thing. And this is how these individuals start to get trapped, right? And how there is this sick sort of rationality within their behavior, because obviously as that system progresses and kind of continues over the years, that initial motivation to get all of the positives, even if you're getting a lot of false positives, you want to make sure you're getting all the people plotting against you, even if you get a lot of people who aren't. That impulse, that underlying game, is only strengthened as this progresses. It's really a feedback loop that's contributive to further and further kind of radicalization and violence from the dictator. So that's sort of the first point here, right? Is that the Biden administration, I think, is really smart to offer this. I think it makes a lot of sense, even though it's sort of counterintuitive. Why would we want to go anywhere near this guy? Really, they're interested in kind of protecting America's geopolitical backyard, and it would be a huge, geostrategic win for any U.S. administration to see a more moderate regime, a friendlier regime, move into power in Venezuela. A more representative regime would really demonstrate a win for liberal democracy if that system could return to that kind of that country could return to that kind of a system. And I think this would also be in a more long-term way, in a more nebulous way, be pretty contributive to lessening some of the tensions on the southern border as well. So it'd be kind of a double win for the Biden administration. And that brings us sort of to the second point here, which is why would Trump? Obviously, he was joking on this live stream with Musk about them fleeing to Venezuela, but he's actually, I believe, made this joke before. It seems to be sort of an interesting obsession of his. And I don't want to draw a parallel. Trump obviously has sort of strongman aspirations and is the most illiberal U.S. president, certainly in my lifetime, and probably within the 20th century at the very least. But he's no Nicolas Maduro, right? He's not. Maybe he would be if given that power, but he hasn't demonstrated that kind of behavior in the past. But I think his joking about it is sort of a flip side of the same coin, right? Is that as you create, if you are asserting yourself to be above the law, you're inherently creating a tension, right? Where if the law returns, right? If you go from a situation where one individual is operating above the rule of law, then rule of law is re-institutionalized, re-implemented in a polity, and all of a sudden you're on the legal hook, right? You have all this legal jeopardy that you didn't before. It's going to appeal to you to get out of that system while you can, right? And we see this a lot with with strongmen, as I sort of just intimated. But I think Trump has his own personal proclivities and interests in existing that kind of system. I think that's the main thing kind of driving this obsession from him. But it's also just interesting to note that it follows kind of one to one, right? There is this feedback loop of the more liberal your behavior, the more anti-rule of law your behavior, the more you're afraid of rule of law, the more you don't want to kind of continue to inhabit a polity that's undergirded, that's determined by that kind